Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, City Lights celebrates the publication of a groundbreaking and radical new treatise on time, quantum physics, and racial justice. It's titled Dismantling the Master's Clock on Race, Space, and Time. It's published by our friends over at AK Press. We are honored to have with us tonight world-renowned artist, visionary, and activist Rasheedah Phillips of Black Quantum Futurism. Before we begin, as is customary, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd like to take this moment in an offering of respect for those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Dismantling the Master's Clock makes the argument that our dominant perception of time owes more to Western history and social order than to a fact of nature. It draws on philosophy, archival research, quantum physics, and Rasheedah Phillips' own art practice and work on housing policy to expand the horizons of what can be imagined and ultimately achieved in facilitating the emergence of a just, equitable, and more visionary society. Rasheedah Phillips is a queer housing advocate, lawyer, parent, and interdisciplinary artist working through a Black futurist lens. Ms. Phillips is the founder of the Afro-Futurist Affair, founding member of the Metropolarity Queer Speculative Fiction Collective, and co-creator of the art duo Black Quantum Futurisms. Ms. Phillips' work has been featured in the New York Times, The Wire, New York Magazine, Boston Review, amongst others. Joining Ms. Phillips tonight in conversation is none other than Fred Moten. Fred Moten is one of our nation's great thinkers. He studies the social practice of poetry and criticism. He is the author of numerous scholarly and creative books. These include such titles as Perennial Fashion, Presence Falling, All That Beauty, The Universal Machine, Stolen Life, and much, much more. His most recent work in collaboration with Brandon Lopez and Gerald Cleaver is The Blacksmith's The Flowers, which is published by Reading Group Records. He lives in New York and teaches at New York University. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Rasheedah Phillips in conversation with Fred Moten. It is such a great honor to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, especially to be here in conversation with Fred Moten. Really appreciate you showing up this evening. So before we get into our conversation, I'm going to do a brief reading. Peter, I'm wondering if you will make me host. I will share screen for a few minutes. In the African-American folktale, Brer Rabbit's race with Brer Turtle, Brer Rabbit, confident in his swiftness, agrees to a race. Yet, in a clever twist, the turtle enlists his kin to aid in an elaborate ruse. By dressing each family member identically and positioning them strategically along a path marked by hills and valleys, the turtles create an illusion of continuous progress. Each time Brer Rabbit encounters a turtle ahead of him on the path, it seems as though Brer Turtle is perpetually in the lead. This culminates at the finish line, where the real Brer Turtle waits, appearing to have far outpaced the rabbit. This loop of misdirection contrasts starkly with its classical counterpart in Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare, where the hare's laziness leads to his downfall, imparting a moral of steady diligence over swift complacency. Instead of valorizing individual speed and linear progression, hallmarks of the Western arrow of time, instead, in the African-American folktale, the turtle employs the strategy of collective effort that disrupts the linear narrative. That multiple temporal events can coexist and influence each other exemplifies the cyclical and relational concepts of time and of success as a product of collective support and shared wisdom. This folktale reflects Black and Afrodiasporic temporal forms of consciousness that are deeply ingrained in processes of community, nature, and the cosmos. And that includes Black holes, Black holes are both mystifying and formidable. These regions in space have such an intense gravitational pull that nothing can elude their heavy grasp, including light. First theorized by Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity in 1915, the concept of black holes introduced the idea that massive objects can warp the fabric of space-time. Einstein described the relationship between space, time, gravity, and matter, and opened the door to the theoretical possibility of black holes. However, the concept of black holes was so radical that even Einstein had misgivings, concluding in a 1939 paper that the idea was not convincing and did not exist in the real world. The development of the idea of black holes from Einstein's general relativity is generally credited to theoretical physicist Carl Schwarzschild. Schwarzschild found that a hypothetical singularity could literally punch through space-time. This point of no escape, known as the event horizon, marked the boundary beyond which nothing could return. Initially known as frozen stars, the term black hole was first printed in a January 18, 1964 issue of Science Newsletter in an article written by Anne Ewing, recapping a symposium from the previous year. While it remains uncertain who exactly coined the term, it's widely attributed to American physicist John Wheeler, who used it in 1967 to describe the end of a massive star, one that exhausted its nuclear fuel and collapsed in on itself. This gravitational collapse is the natural end of the star's life cycle, where it can no longer support its own weight through nuclear fission. The star compresses its mass into an extremely small and dense point known as a singularity, which is then surrounded by the event horizon. Black holes are characterized by their strong gravitational fields, which can affect nearby matter and energy. For instance, a star passing too close to a black hole risks being ripped apart by gravitational forces in a process known as tidal disruption. Additionally, black holes can bend light around them. Another effect of black holes is time dilation, a consequence also of their intense gravity. And according to general relativity, time passes slower near a strong gravitational field. Therefore, time near a black hole would appear to pass more slowly compared to an observer at a safe distance. Black holes can also significantly influence cosmic events and have a major role in the evolution and formation of galaxies. But black holes also harbor a deep-seated paradox at the intersection of quantum physics and general relativity that challenges our foundational understanding of physics. Quantum physics posits that information can never be destroyed and must be conserved. It maintains that all physical data about a system, such as its position, its speed, its spin of particles, can theoretically be traced through time. On the other hand, general relativity argues that anything entering a black hole is lost forever. According to this theory, anything that crosses that event horizon, including light and information, cannot escape, and thus it's effectively removing the information from our observable universe. The fate of this information, according to general relativity, appears to be destruction, which directly conflicts with the conservation principle of quantum mechanics. And under these circumstances, information is defined as all the data or knowledge contained within an object or system. This includes all the characteristics that make something unique and that distinguish it from other things. Despite various proposed theories and models, the fate of information swallowed by black holes remains an unresolved conflict between quantum mechanics and general relativity. It highlights a key area where our current understanding of physics is incomplete or in need of deeper integration. And this discourse around black holes and their implications also extends into broader cultural and ontological frameworks and contexts, particularly in the ways that we conceive of light and darkness. Western scientific tradition often frames these as binary opposites, a dichotomy that's rooted in theological and philosophical narratives, where light is invariably aligned with order, with clarity, with divinity, and darkness is associated with chaos, with obscurity, and the unknown. In other cultures, though, light and dark are viewed as complementary, as interdependent, as interacting forces that depend on one another to exist and do not pre-exist absent each other. But when we look at Christian biblical narratives, for example, Black is the darkness before time began, and without light, the earth was without form and void. The first few lines of the Bible has God creating light by divine decree, and upon seeing that the light was good, God deliberately separated the light from the darkness. This narrative not only reflects, but also perpetuates a long-standing metaphysical dualism that privileges light over darkness. Philosophical interpretations argue that this dichotomy is not a primordial state, but it's rather a division instantiated by divine command, suggesting that the divine transcends and manipulates this binary. This reading is in fact, in quote, a reversal of the initial dualistic cast that late antiquity gave to metaphors of light. And this view is further complicated by discussions in color theory and philosophy, where Black is often dismissed as a non-color, as a symbol of negation, as absence rather than a substantive entity. In the dictionary of symbols, for example, Black sucks in color and does not return it. Above all, it suggests chaos, nothingness, night sky, night shadows on the ground, evil, anguish, sorrow, the unconscious, and death. Philosopher Roy Sorensen attributes this friction surrounding the status of Blackness to an aversion to negative things, whereas other colors are seen by virtue of light simulation. The light itself can be colored, but it cannot be Black. These prevailing notions underscore a broader, often unchallenged belief that darkness lacks the capacity to convey, to carry, or to retain information, in stark contrast to light, which enables us to observe or perceive information. This dichotomy parallels theoretical debates in physics, particularly concerning black holes and information theory. Such perspectives are pivotal as they reinforce the skewed perception where darkness is seen as less substantive or informative than light. All right, I'm not going to have time to read all of this, so I'm going to just skip around a little bit because time is what it is. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the causal theory of perception, and you can read more about this in the book. But basically, the causal theory of perception offers insights into how we perceive objects and phenomena. And according to this theory, our ability to see and perceive objects and phenomena is intrinsically linked to the notion of causation. And so this means that an object or an event only becomes visible to us when it triggers a causal chain that involves light. In other words, a sequence of events or processes that ultimately lead to the sensation of sight in an observer. For instance, light reflecting off an object and entering the eyes initiates a chain reaction that involves the retina, the optic nerves, and the brain, and that results in the perception of an object. This linear causal model, in turn, introduces the notion of causation through absence. And so that implies that if an object or phenomena does not initiate this causal chain, for example, if it fails to reflect or emit light that reaches our eyes, it remains invisible to us. And thus visibility, seeing an object, hinges on the object's interaction with light, which suggests a limitation in our perceptual capabilities to only those entities that actively participate in that cause and effect process. And this perspective bias underlines the supposed limitations of human perception. It suggests that any element not engaging in that perceptual causal chain remains outside our visual awareness. However, the linear causal model of perception is challenged by black holes, suggesting a need to rethink our classical understanding of light and darkness and causality. Black holes, for instance, though invisible in traditional optical terms because they trap all light, reveal their presence through their gravitational effects on nearby objects and radiation emitted by matter as it spirals into them. These observations indicate that regions that are devoid of light, gravitational absences, still exert significant influence on their surroundings. And that challenges the long-held view that absences do not transmit energy or do anything else positive. Other modern quantum theories have challenged Newton's classical viewpoint, where the behavior of light at the quantum scale, such as the behavior of photons, adds more depth. So unlike classical particles, which travel in fixed straight line trajectories, photons, which are quantum particles of light, exhibit both wave-like and particle-like properties. In their work, Diffracting Diffraction, Karen Berard underscores quantum light behaviors to challenge the precept that darkness and light are at odds, arguing that the famous two-slit experiment in quantum physics queers the binary light and dark story. And that experiment, which illustrates the nature of light, doesn't conform to a simple dichotomy of light versus dark. We see that in that experiment, a fundamental demonstration in quantum mechanics and optics, particles such as electrons or photons are fired through two adjacent slits onto a detector screen. Rather than form two distinct clusters on the screen that correspond to these two slits, these particles create an interference pattern that manifests as alternating bands of light and dark on the screen. This pattern is essential for unraveling the experiment's impact on our understanding of light and dark. The pattern, consisting of alternating bright and dark bands, represents points where the waves of particles add peaks and where the waves align, and the dark bands emerge where they cancel each other out. All of that means that that interference pattern that occurs even when particles are sent through slits one at a time suggests that each particle interferes with itself as if it were a wave. It's not just a single point-like particle. It's not just a single point in time. And so this concept of wave-particle duality arose from trying to explain that phenomenon. And the concept complementarity principle posits that fundamental particles exhibit both those characteristics, both waves and particles, depending on how they're observed. And so that duality blurs the line between the traditional separate concepts of waves associated with continuity and spread, akin to light, and particles that are discrete and localized, akin to points of darkness. These things that challenge those conventional dichotomies. And Berard's interpretation extends this idea into the realms of cultural and philosophical understandings of light and darkness. By demonstrating that particles and waves are not distinct, but instead are intertwined phenomena, the two-slit experiment suggests a view where light and darkness are not opposites, but are part of a continuum. Berard proposes darkness not as mere absence or lack, but darkness as abundance. A paradigm that centers Black temporalities and that centers darkness as abundance also sees Blackness as abundance. The Dictionary of Symbols states, for example, that in the West, Black is the color of mourning, but it's also the symbol of fertility. In ancient Egypt, for example, and in North Africa, it's the symbol of the color of rich earth and of rain clouds. If it is as Black as the ocean depths, it is because the underworld contains the treasury of hidden life and because it is the storehouse of all things. And so reimagining Black holes under this paradigm, they're no longer just destructive forces that merely negate or annihilate light and information. Instead, Black holes emerge as transformative phenomena that actively preserve and metamorphose information. This conceptual shift reveals darkness as a potent an active element of the cosmos, one that conserves and reshapes information. They're not just entities that destroy space-time. They contribute to its creation, to its evolution, to its regeneration. This can already be recognized in everyday phenomena in nature. Things require cycles of darkness as well as light to grow and to change. This underscores the fundamental balance between these two states, which is crucial across ecological, biological, and again, cosmic processes. Extending this concept to a broader cosmological perspective, cycles of light and darkness is also foundational to the formation and evolution of celestial bodies. The collapse of dust and gas that due to gravity leads to the creation of planets and stars occurs in the dark recesses of space. These areas, far from the intense radiation of stars, allows for the aggregation of matter and the eventual ignition of nuclear fission in stars, or the accretion of material in plants. Moreover, it is the darkness of space that where the universe's most dramatic transformations occur. The death of stars, the birth of black holes, phenomena that can reshape the structure of the cosmos itself. Afrodiasporic perspectives contribute significantly to this discourse, not conceiving of space as simply a void, nor of blackness as being devoid of information. Instead, both are regarded as sacred, as filled with potential and meaning. Here we can take Christina Sharp's notion of blackness anew, blackness as atemporal, in and out of place and time, putting pressure on meaning and that against which meaning is made, end quote. The space and time entry in the Encyclopedia of African Religions explains that space is a means by which creation and all life forms can exist and interact. The Africans have understood that space and time are mutually dependent. Space in this view is not a passive backdrop for physical events. It is active. It is an integral part of its existence. It facilitates interactions and manifestations of life. Such a holistic view of space, time, and matter, as understood in some African philosophies, as understood in the Tale of Brer Rabbit, resonate with our quantum physics understanding of the universe as well. All right, I'm going to stop there because I could read a lot more, but would love to get into conversation. And you can read the rest of that chapter in full in, I think it's in chapter 2 of Dismantling the Master's Clock.
Well, thank you so much, Rasheedah, for giving us such a generous sample of the book, and thank you for the book. It's a really extraordinary and groundbreaking and cosmos reforming piece of work. And I think I have some really basic questions that I would like to ask, if that's okay.
I love it. Love a basic question.
Okay. Well, one is just how long have you been interested in physics and cosmology, and how did you get interested in it? And then I'll kind of follow up from there.
Yeah, so my entry into physics really came through science fiction. I've been interested in science fiction since I was a child. I was reading growing up stuff like My Teacher is an Alien by Bruce Colville. I was reading Stephen King when I was far too young to be reading Stephen King. People like Christopher Pike. So like my childhood was filled with like aliens, outer space, all of these sort of things. And then I grew up, I was a teenager in 99 and early 2000s when The Matrix came out, and The Matrix was like it for me. Like it still is my favorite movie ever. Right. And so that got me into thinking about philosophy and quantum physics, like all of these interesting things and ways of thinking about reality and how reality could be broken down and challenged. And during those times I was writing my own science fiction, and I started writing time travel science fiction around that time too. And so that also got me into like thinking about physics, and just like, again, how do you break down time to tell the kind of stories and to tell the kind of experiences of bending time in the way that you want to, and to like justify it against reality. And so I tried to figure out, I was having these experiences that I was writing about and had to like call science fiction, but really I was like searching for a way to like relate it to reality. Like, how is this
Mhm.
possible that I can experience time in this way, or I can think about time in this way? How can reality justify it? So I think that's where I started to really get into physics and quantum physics and be like, oh, okay, in quantum physics, this is a thing. Time can move backwards, time can move in these different directions, or time can be entangled in this way. And so that, yeah, that kind of was my entryway into it.
Well, it's so interesting to hear you say that because it kind of touches on I think some intuitions that obviously a lot of a lot of Black thinkers and Black writers have had, even in ways that sort of transcend the normal temporal boundaries that we like to place on science fiction or speculative fiction. Um, I often think of this in relation to Harriet Jacobs's incidents in the life of a slave girl, in which it really feels like there's so many different ways in which it feels like Jacobs is able to somehow be in two places at the same time. She continually works this capacity to do so. And I guess I was just thinking, I wonder if it's a matter of that your work so sort of powerfully disrupts the sort of metaphysical consensus that is so committed to the devaluation of blackness and darkness and therefore Black life. And it feels like what you're suggesting is that even if that metaphysics somehow both shapes our lives, but it doesn't really correspond to our lives, that maybe physics, and maybe particularly quantum physics, actually corresponds to Black life in some way that that the relay between classical mechanics and classical metaphysics doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's simple in some ways, right? But that sort of timeless understanding that how we think about the world shapes how we see the world in some ways, right? I mean, it's that's a very simplistic way of putting it out, obviously, right? And it's almost reductive in some ways, right? But in some ways it isn't, right? It's like the kind of words we use, the way in which we think about reality shapes the reality around us in some ways, or it moves and bends in that way. And that's also, we've been told, right, if we think about that in terms of a individualistic experience, then it does become very divorced from like, how can I as an individual shape reality, right? But when there's a metaphysics of like collectivity, like we all together like shape reality or shape the conditions that make things possible in the world. And when you understand it as part of a tradition, as part of a lineage of rituals and ways of being in the world that is different from what you've been indoctrinated with and have had to deal with all of your life, which is a very westernized, individualistic, every man for himself way of moving through the world, that all of the rules for how you can exist and what's possible are all shaped by that. And so, yeah, it starts ultimately with the metaphysics, and then like reality does bend in that way towards that. And again, it also starts with like, we're so set on believing that what science says is definitive, and that's how we've been taught to regard science as an authority, when it's a type of authority, right? But it's in the same way, and I talk about this in a book. It's in the same way that laws of legal laws are, an authority, right? And they can be challenged, and they are shaped by particular people for types of circumstances that then get projected onto everyone, right? And so the same thing with science, like it's not even, right? And that's one of the things that I learned in my residency at CERN is like, time is not a fixed thing. We're told that, but like even how scientists experiment with time and use time It's defined depending on the experiment. It's defined depending on the circumstances. It's not a fixed thing. Even the rate of time changes depending on if they're measuring a particle versus measuring a thing. So like, if that's possible for y'all to challenge time and like, why wouldn't it be possible for me as a everyday person who's also made of particles and quarks and all of these other things? So
Yeah. Well, not only possible, but also actual insofar as a whole lot of our historical experience is about this flexibility of time in a sense, right? So much Black music literally enacts these processes which stretch time and compress time and also, you know, that sense of the reversibility, let's say, of the arrow of time. Not only the fact that it bends, but also that it's reversible, in that way that I guess Richard Feynman began to work through. All of these things seem to me, and this is partly what I'm deriving from your book. Part of what I'm deriving from your book, rather, is that, you know, we need to understand this physics in order to understand some of the deep mysteries of Black history, not the least of which is just the mystery of how we've survived.
yeah, and also that physics has a history. It is not
Mhm.
it's not something that was created in a vacuum. Science has a history, medicine has a history, time has, as to quote Karen Barard, time has a history.
Mhm.
And these things are all shaped by political considerations, racial, all of these different contexts that again they're served to us on a platter and said, hey, here's a law of thermodynamics that says, but right, all of that context is left out about how that came to be. And again, it makes us feel as though we can't challenge it, we can't push up against it. But time, and I talk about this in the book, the history of the clock is very much connected and tied to colonialism, very straight up. Like the perfection of the clock on the ship is what led Captain Cook to be able to get to Australia, right? But that whole thing is left out when we're talking about time and how it's used and how it orders our society, our cosmos, our affairs. That history is left out, that context is left out. But when you have that context, right, like, again, doctors, for example, aren't gods who are given them, right. Medicine was perfected by experimentation on Black bodies, right? Like that is there, that is part of the history, but we don't talk about it. Again, we sort of assume things, and then we don't challenge them. And so, in my work as a person who's done a lot of work around spatial justice, that issue of time and how it comes up and how it oppresses folks and how it, and again, we think of it as objective, as something that, I go into a courtroom, I'm supposed to be talking to someone who's objective in a objective neutral place, right? But it's absolutely not. The way that time is constructed within a courtroom when someone's being evicted is very much skewed towards power, towards authority, towards property owners, towards white people, right? All of these different things that are embedded in a supposedly neutral object of a clock or a map or whatever object we want to call on.
Well, can you say a little bit more about how this critical and expanded way that you're thinking about time actually has an impact on your work as an advocate and as an organizer?
Yeah, it takes us out of the realm of things being deterministic, and more often than not, that is the power of it. It takes it from being an inevitable result, whatever that inevitability in our mind that we have constructed around. If a person is a low income person, they don't, they're a tenant, they don't deserve to have longevity, or they don't deserve the same level of stability. All these sort of deep seated values that have been built into all the systems, all the institutions, right? And how that plays out is, again, I've been a lawyer for a long time. I've represented people who have lost their homes, both tenants and homeowners. When you're a homeowner, it can take I can make a foreclosure play out in 7 years, right? I can file a
Mhm.
bankruptcy, I can do all these things, right? Because of how we value property owners, right? And keep in mind that property ownership is originally tied to race and tied to status, all those things. For a tenant, because we value tenants less in this country, In some places, you as a tenant get 3 days, right? And I can maybe extend that to 30 days if I try hard, right? But just that difference in value of time, right? And of the inevitability of a result based on a system where a certain type of time is already built in and is already skewed towards one person over another or type of person over another. The power of being conscious of that is a whole other strategy tool for me. And so I can help create or build a law, build a policy that, for example, erases eviction records or seals eviction records so that that eviction record, that past mark that's now locked in time, won't have the same impact on the future as it might have otherwise, as what, again, when we talk about determinism. And so things like Afrofuturism and just sort of temporalities that of hope that tell us that the future is not predetermined. It can be different than the present. It can be different than the past. We can change the conditions of the past that create the present. That alone is really powerful. And it brings in a new suite of tools and imaginations and challenges to the status quo.
No, it's really interesting because it's amazing to see the ways that this sort of mobilization of indeterminacy does sort of generate these new temporalities of hope that you're describing. But what's also really cool is that in this very, very practical way, you can figure out ways to mobilize indeterminacy even within the various institutions which are so committed to a metaphysics of determination and to the racialization of that metaphysics. So the fact that you can bring indeterminacy literally into the courtroom, into the hearing room, is like a really, really powerful, really powerful thing. I I was, and it kind of raises for me another question, because I know you mentioned the impact of speculative fiction for you, in your coming up, and of course it made me think not just about Jacobs as a sort of early prefiguration of that, but other great Black writers in the genre too, Samuel R. Delany, Octavia Butler, who you write about in the book a lot, and more recent folks, like N.K. Jemisin. But I was thinking, I almost feel like there's this really cool new genre that you've created, and I guess I would call it like speculative nonfiction.
Mm.
It's like this way again of mobilizing physics, particularly at this sort of scary intersection of physics and biology, right? To constitute some new ways of understanding the actuality of our world. That link between a new physics and biology is especially interesting because within the physics framework, not that many people go there. Maybe Feynman in some of his later work, or Schrodinger in What is Life. But by in the ways that you've done it, it seems like it's opening up a new frontier, because that specific relation between physics and biology is working out for you, obviously with regard to race and gender and sexuality. I'm trying to figure out where to put a question mark there, but I think maybe I'll just shut up and let you
No.
talk. So,
No, I'm happy to respond. I mean, yeah, I think that is a part of how I approach the work, and I talk about this in the book. And I've been lucky to be part of in Philadelphia. I was part of a speculative queer sci-fi collective where called Metropolarity, where we talked about the line between speculation and reality being non-existent. And so we always wrote stories that were based in Philadelphia and that were like a part of the fabric of everyday life, and tried to, really heighten verisimilitude. I always don't know how to say that word, verisimilitude, in our writings, to say like, this is real, like my existence as a Black queer person, parent in Philadelphia is science fiction. And I'm writing a real story. I have to call it speculation because y'all gonna look at me like I'm crazy, right? And I'm gonna be called, whatever, by science people. Which is why, like, slowly, right, I've shifted into nonfiction writing, and to try to like break it down in sort of philosophical terms that can be accepted in the mainstream, in ways that even like speculation is not, right? So yes, that is that is an intentional piece on my part, and part of my and you know, I follow in a long tradition of folks who do that, right? And um specifically, and why am I blanking on his last name right now? I'm so embarrassed. Derek, the lawyer, who wrote science fiction. Ah, why am I blanking on his name? I'm so bad. Derek Bell. Yes, thank you so much, audience. Yes. So following in his tradition, right, of like these science fiction stories that were parables, that were actual reality being spoken and being speculated in this kind of like thought experiment. So kind of like writing in that tradition as well. And you know what Sadia Hartman calls these critical fabulations. Absolutely right. And for me, like not being able to trace my family back beyond a certain, as a descendant of chattel slavery, past a certain time, like critical fabulation and speculation becomes a necessity for being able to connect to ancestral memory and to other ways of being outside of the Black American context. And that's not at all to disparage the Black American context, right? Because it also has its own rich temporal traditions, you know, of course, that derive from the Afro diaspora. But I'm also like super interested in like, what's the traditions of Black women in Philadelphia who grew up in Philadelphia? Like, what's their temporal traditions and rituals? And so, you know, I dive into some of that too as well. So yeah, I don't know where, if I answered the question or not question, but yeah.
Oh no, definitely, definitely. I mean, I think one of the cool things is this is such a rich addition to, you know, a whole kind of trajectory of Black writers and Black scholars who have taken up these questions about physics in interesting ways. And I'm thinking of Denise Da Silva, and Michelle Wright, especially in her really great book, The Physics of Blackness. I think what makes your book such a new and welcome departure is that in some ways it really asks us to consider the blackness of physics, you know, and that in some ways these sort of strange things that quantum mechanics especially is asking us to think about that exceed our normative sort of understanding of what's visible and of what can show up for us. Um, that in fact, what physics is doing is engaging in a kind of reorientation of what can be known that obviously Black folks and Black culture have been engaging in for many years, especially on these shores. So I'm hoping that like there are a whole bunch of physicists who are reading your book too. You know, I'm imagining all the new discoveries that might emerge for them now as a function of widening the epistemological frame within which they understand their own work.
I hope that too. And, you know, of course I want to be humble, but you know, I had some really great conversations with physicists when I had the opportunity, all the times that I've had the opportunity to go to CERN and
Mhm.
other places through residencies. And you know, folks are more open than one might think, in terms
Mhm.
of being able to think about and engage. And part of it could be right, like that they're self-selected folks who are like, yeah, we'll engage with this artist in this residency and we'll have this conversation. But I had some really rich conversations with folks who were like way more open-minded than one would think about testing and poking around the fringes of like, this is what time is or isn't, or how is time showing up in these things. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's I hope so too. I hope that too.
Well, I think I'm scared we might be running close to time, but I wanted to bring Peter back in and maybe he can help us to glean some of the questions that might have come up in the chat or elsewhere. So
Yeah, some of the comments have been beginning to arrive. Emma says, haven't read The Life of a Slave Girl yet, but what Mr. Moten said about it feeling like Jacobs is in two places at once made me think about the writing on astral projection by Asada, and in Asada by Asada Shakur. And then let's see, somebody else says, I'm thinking a lot about the piece where you said seeing an object hinges on the object's relationship to light.
And Fred, maybe I can ask you a question if that would be okay.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I have lots of questions for you, but part of what I wanted to talk about when I was thinking about reading the piece about sound is, you know, you write a lot about Black music and, you know, references around bending time with music. And I was just wondering how you think about sonic disruptions that can like sort of challenge normative temporalities.
Well, it's funny. I'm teaching a class right now on performance and technology, and I guess the basic sort of approach that we're making in the class is to think a lot about percussion, and by extension to think a lot about rhythm, and um, and so there's a really cool uh, there's a great pianist whose work I admire a lot, and he's also a really great scholar, an important thinker named Vijay Iyer. And I was thinking a lot about this in relation to a particular song that Vijay plays on an album called Historicity. Um, it's a well, there's a bunch of different versions that he does of this particular phenomenon where he just figures out ways to like it's like well, I was spoke of Harriet Jacobs sort of seeming like she's in two places at the same time. And VJ's work kind of makes you feel like you're in two times in the same place, right? These sort of really amazing, crazy rhythmic signatures that occur. And he's constantly doing this in relation to, you know, just in relation to even at the level of the titles of the work, particularly of his trios. So we spent about 2 weeks just thinking about the reversibility and the spiraling effects of time that you can listen to when you hear music in this sort of, I would say maybe with regard to VJ, especially in this sort of Afro-Asiatic traditions, you know. So a lot of what I guess I'm trying to do, and I totally connect it. I hope I can connect it with what you're trying to do, is to just say that, you know, if you kind of expand your horizons and think through um, uncommon, let's say, or unacknowledged or devalued experiences, your whole relation to space and time can change, right? And this is something that, again, yeah, like, you know, Black folks and oppressed people in the world know about this because it's a tool for survival. So the question would be, how does it get, you know, regenerated and shared so that it can become a tool for thriving and not just surviving? Uh, oh, we got some good questions. Some more. Um, somebody, oh, let's see. Oberine Odara says, hi, I am a Brazilian Black girl, and I wrote a project to enter into a PhD program in Brazil to study time in 2020. And I'm here in California now doing my doctoral stages for 9 months. And she discovered you and your book 2 weeks ago, Rasheedah. She says she didn't start to read it because she's really scared. She seems like she's scared with how similar that you and her think. And I'm wondering how do you as a writer deal with that particular kind of fear, right? That you ever that kind of thing where there's a kind of weird way in which you're really excited to see somebody thinking along the same lines as you, and at the same time, it feels scary that they're thinking along the same lines because you're wondering, well, what is there left for me to say? How have you ever had that feeling, and how do you deal with it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, yes, with a lot of people and thinkers. I mean, I don't know. As a writer, right, you deal with it in a lot of different ways. I mean, part of it is like understanding where the feeling is coming from, and like trying to go deep and to be like, what does that mean? Because at least in the sort of Western traditions, a lot of that starts to get into like intellectual property, and am I saying the same copyright, and it's like, actually no, that should signal to you that you're actually on the right path towards a greater truth that is being embodied, that different people are coming. So it's like having to shift into that kind of mode of thinking. And then sometimes I just like avoid reading stuff by people until I'm finished writing what I want to write, and then I'll go to it and be like, okay, let me incorporate it and make sure I'm referencing it. But yeah, that's kind of how I deal with it.
No, it's like you were saying before, that when it comes to understanding the world as well as changing the world, it's like the more the merrier, and the more the mightier too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We got a whole bunch of questions coming in now. Ramon says, I'm thinking about Goethe's quote, where the light is brightest, the shadows are deepest, unquote. This dualism can be flipped, thus changing the metaphysical contingency of light/dark. Savannah says, these pondering on blackness, time, and music really excite me. I'm wondering what musicians and albums you're loving at the moment, or if there was anything in particular you were listening to while writing.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And I actually made two playlists for two different publications. I'll try to drop it in the chat if I can do it before we hop off. But I revisited a lot of songs from my youth that reference time in these different ways that I didn't like realize at the time. But definitely Sounds of Blackness. There's a whole playlist out there. But one thing I continue to revisit was Jay Dilla's Donuts. Like that was on repeat, 93 Till Infinity, all these different things. So yeah, I'll drop those playlists. There was definitely a bunch of songs, but things that I revisited, and again, things that helped me to think through different ways of thinking about time in the book, right? Like things that I like literally would listen to and be like, oh, this song makes me feel this way, or this song does this kind of thing with notes, with sound, with all of these different things. And that's part of our deeper practice also as part of Black Quantum Futurism. And my partner Kamei Moore-Mother, who's a musician, right? So she brings a lot of this sound consciousness into our thinking and approaches to making our work. So yeah, there's a lot of references to that in the book, but I'll try to drop those playlists in the chat. I made one for the Wire magazine and for another publication.
Fred, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I guess it's obvious, but it's a really cool experience reading your book while listening to Moore-Mother. So I feel like those things, your writing and Kamei's writing go together in these really rich ways. And you know, yeah, so that's definitely I recommend that as a very stiff and delightful cocktail that folks can have for themselves. Yeah. Matter of fact, it makes me, and you're such a good reader of your work anyway, it makes me wonder, have you thought about or have you been approached about doing like an audio book?
I can't stand the sound of my own voice. So have been approached, and I think there's going to be an audio book for this book that they asked me to read, and I was like, no, I will never be able to check it and listen to it again. So someone else is going to do my audio book, but thank you.
All right. Okay.
But we do have, as Black Quantum Futurism, we do have some albums and things online where I'm reading on over top of Kamei's sounds.
Yeah.
So Nicole asks, could you both talk about how you approach ideas of, quote, blackness freed from time, unquote? It's a connective tissue across your work.
Yeah, Fred, do you want to jump in? I feel like I have a lot of different ways I could answer that, and a lot of them are in the book, a lot of like very specific ways. And then I think through my collective Black Quantum Futurism, we have a lot of different tools and practices that we use to sort of disrupt the sort of linearity of time. And I'll just say really quickly that like I don't believe that time doesn't have a usefulness. To me, it really is about disrupting the linearity of Western time in that specific sense. But I find uses for time, and in terms of thinking about time as temporality, as things that are created by community, by culture, by all of these different things that I talk about, by these different traditions and rituals. Time is created with other people. Time is created in community. And so when I think about time like that, it doesn't feel like an oppressive force. It feels generative. It feels like something that has a utility in terms of a functioning community that I would want to be a part of in terms of how we create time, as long as it's not being defined by something external to us.
Yeah, just to echo you, I mean, put it real simply, I suppose, is, we make time. We make time for each other. And really the question is, first of all, the ethics of making time, and also to make sure that the capacity to make time isn't sort of brutally, and unequally distributed.
A comment from Austin. I have a couple of questions. We're reading Dismantling Master's Clock as a book collective and just finished a discussion on chapter 4. What does being in a state of superimposition look like in your day-to-day life? 100 years from now, how do you imagine this book impacting standardized time?
Ooh, Austin. Deep questions. In my day-to-day life, for me, superposition is not, it can be mundane, right? And it's becoming aware in some ways of the mundanity of things like superposition. It's the fact that like I can hear a noise and the things that we call coincidences or synchronicities that are just an everyday part of life that makes it beautiful, that makes it both mundane and like when you really think about it, like, whoa, when you like break it down into the like various physics aspects of it, it's like, whoa, all of these things coming together at this particular moment in time to do all of these different things. And so, and I talk about that in a little bit of the book of like, even the way that a song comes together and the way that the notes are held in a song is an instance of superposition. That's a very mundane, everyday thing. I'm listening to a song and that's superposition. Like that's what's happening right there. So yeah, so for me, it's about finding those things. It's like, it doesn't have to be this big thing. The collapse of space-time, that we see is in some ways really mundane. And that's realizing that and being able to tap into that is what makes it beautiful. But I wish and then I think we use other like kind of tools to like mimic or to get at that. So like we have a tool called the quantum event map that we use in our Black quantum futurism practice that talks about like what are the overlaying things when you treat each phenomena as its own event, the things that you're seeing, the things that you're hearing, the sensations that you're feeling in your body, what you're smelling. When you think about all those things as one event, or as different events that come together at a point in time to give you an experience or a sensation of a thing, that's a superposition of different things all in a moment. So I try to think about it on that level, and in that way it can be less of a challenge to think about like, oh, it's this big science concept that has to be broken down or it has to be this kind of thing, but that it's actually very mundane and it's very much a part of who my body is held together by superposition. My heart beating at the same time that I'm breathing, like that's superposition. Plants, are in superposition as they grow, so like these kind of mundane things. And when I remember those things, it actually makes me happy. I'm smiling right now. And then 100 years from now, how do you imagine this book impacting standardized time? One way I hope is getting rid of time zones and yeah, seeing how and having like more localized, going back to more localized senses of time, more communal communally derived senses of time that don't have to be beholden to the Greenwich clock in England.
Cool. We're coming on the top of the hour, but I think we have time for one more question. Isaac asks, could you talk a bit more about how Philadelphia as a city and the collective you've been part of there has influenced the way you've developed your thoughts on time and temporality?
Oh, it has 1,000,000% influenced how I think about. I mean, I was born in Trenton, but I was raised in Philly, and it is my being. And so how I was raised up, how I think about time and community, the types of ways that I've been able to experience community deeply embedded in Philadelphia, has informed all of this, right? And so it's inextricable from my experiences, and from who I am and from how I think about time and temporality. And again, I spent a lot of my career as a lawyer in Philly, representing people facing homelessness, facing houselessness, facing all sorts of things, as well as people creating daycares. I've represented childcare providers, all sorts of people. And so those things all inform how I think about the world, the observations that I've been able to make about time. And Philly's just a really special place. And it has its own temporality. And then even within different neighborhoods, they have their own temporality. And I talk about that. I lived a lot of my time in North Philadelphia, where I went to Temple University, and where I've, again, represented people. I've been part of the community board, all of these different experiences that, again, play into observations about how people get displaced from space-time, get disrupted from space-time in practical ways, not in like abstract sci-fi ways, but in very practical ways, have their space and time disrupted, have their futures disrupted, have their futures planned for them by other entities. And I've been able to see that in Philadelphia, and have been able to work with community to intervene in those ways. And Philly is a very Afrofuturist city, where I've been able to create, I created an organization called the Afrofuturist Affair, where we had annual charity and costume balls there, and Sun Ra lived there, right? And so just it's such a Black Afrofuturist city, that I couldn't help it if I tried, in terms of just being influenced deeply by it.
Fred Moten, any final thoughts before we wind down?
Oh, no, other than, I mean, I'm sure everybody who's here has already been totally convinced that they should get this book immediately. But if you haven't, let me say I think it's a wonderful book, and I'm really thankful to Rasheedah for writing it, and thankful to you, Peter, and to her for letting me talk with her about it tonight.
Well, I would like to thank the both of you for your generosity, for your insights, and for spending this time with us. Rasheedah Phillips, congratulations for this very significant, vital, and mind-blowing book. Mr. Moten, thank you for doing the honors and for your thoughtfulness and your generosity. It has been an honor to have you both with us here tonight. So tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. Be strong, be kind to each other. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much. This was beautiful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fun. So, and congratulations again. I'm really happy to see so many people excited about this work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for setting an example and being an inspiration as well.